Scott, I looked right into it. I looked into the core.
Chernobyl, the night the world changed forever. On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. In the quiet forests of northern Ukraine, just a few kilometers from the young city of Pripyat, stood one of the Soviet Union's greatest technological achievements, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was a symbol of progress, scientific ambition, and national pride. Few could have imagined that within hours it would become the site of the worst nuclear disaster in human history. For millions of people, life was about to change forever. But to understand what happened that night, we must first understand the world that existed before the explosion. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was built during the 1970s, when the Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its nuclear energy program. Electricity was essential for industry, cities, and military development, and nuclear power promised enormous amounts of energy without burning fossil fuels. The station was located near the border of Ukraine and Belarus, approximately 130 kilometers north of Kiev. Nearby, an entirely new city was constructed, Pripyat. Pripyat was unlike most Soviet cities. It was modern, clean, and designed specifically for the workers of the power plant and their families. Wide streets, schools, hospitals, amusement parks, swimming pools, cinemas, and apartment buildings made it one of the most comfortable places to live in the Soviet Union. Nearly 50,000 people called Pripyat home. Many were young engineers, scientists, technicians, teachers, doctors, and their children. They believed they were helping build the future. The Chernobyl station itself consisted of several RBMK-1000 nuclear reactors. These reactors were among the largest ever built and were capable of producing massive amounts of electricity. However, hidden beneath their impressive design were serious flaws. The RBMK reactor used graphite to slow down neutrons and ordinary water for cooling. While this design was efficient and relatively inexpensive, it also had dangerous characteristics that engineers did not fully appreciate or chose not to discuss publicly. One of the most critical problems involved the reactor's behavior at low power levels. Instead of becoming naturally safer when power decreased, the RBMK reactor could actually become unstable under certain conditions. Another design flaw existed inside the control rods themselves. These rods were supposed to reduce the nuclear reaction when inserted into the reactor core. But because of the graphite tips attached to them, pressing the emergency shutdown button could briefly increase reactor power before reducing it. Few operators fully understood how dangerous this flaw could become. Even more troubling was the culture surrounding the Soviet nuclear industry. Questioning official procedures was discouraged. Admitting mistakes was often viewed as weakness. Engineers were expected to follow instructions rather than challenge them. Safety concerns sometimes remained hidden behind secrecy and bureaucracy. Years before the disaster, several experts had already warned about potential problems within the RBMK design. Some incidents had occurred at other nuclear stations. Reports were written. Recommendations were made. But many of these warnings never reached the people operating the reactors. As a result, thousands of workers continued their daily routines, believing the reactors were completely safe. By April 1986, Reactor No. 4 had been operating for several years. It had generated enormous amounts of electricity and appeared to be functioning normally. Yet beneath its steel and concrete structure, conditions were slowly aligning toward disaster. On April 25, engineers prepared for an important safety test. Ironically, the purpose of the experiment was to improve reactor safety. If external power failed, large pumps that circulated cooling water would temporarily lose electricity before diesel backup generators started. Engineers wanted to know whether the spinning turbine could continue generating enough electricity during those crucial seconds. The experiment had already failed before. Now they intended to repeat it. The test required reducing the reactor's power to a very low level. According to the plan, operators would gradually lower power while disabling several automatic safety systems that might interrupt the experiment. Everything appeared carefully organized on paper. But reality would unfold very differently. During the afternoon, an unexpected request arrived from the regional power grid. Electricity demand remained higher than expected. Plant managers were instructed to continue producing power for several additional hours. The planned test had to be delayed. This seemingly ordinary decision would have enormous consequences. Because of the delay, the experienced day shift left work before the experiment began. Responsibility passed to the night shift. Many members of the night crew had not originally expected to perform such a complicated test. Although they were trained operators, they had less preparation for the exact experiment scheduled that evening. Late that night, operators finally received permission to continue. Power reduction began. Everything seemed normal. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of stabilizing at the planned level, reactor power dropped dramatically, far below the intended target. The reactor entered an unstable operating condition. Inside the core, changes in temperature, steam production, and neutron behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Operators now faced a difficult decision. According to proper safety procedures, the test should have been canceled. The reactor should have been shut down completely. Instead, believing the situation could still be corrected, they attempted to raise power again. To accomplish this, many control rods were withdrawn from the reactor. Far more than safety regulations allowed. The reactor slowly recovered enough power to continue the experiment. On the surface, everything appeared under control. Control panels displayed numbers. Pumps continued circulating water. Turbines spun as they always had. Workers monitored instruments while communicating calmly over radios and telephones. Outside the station, Pripyat slept peacefully. Families rested inside apartment buildings. Children dreamed about the coming weekend. Many were excited because May Day celebrations were only days away. At the nearby amusement park, brightly painted rides stood ready for their official opening. The famous Ferris wheel had not yet carried a single passenger. No one suspected that it would soon become one of the world's most recognizable symbols of abandonment. Midnight passed. Inside Reactor 4, the safety test approached its final stage. Automatic emergency systems had been disabled according to the testing procedure. Cooling conditions continued changing. Steam bubbles began forming inside the reactor channels. Unknown to the operators, the reactor was becoming increasingly unstable with every passing second. Still, the control room remained calm. No alarm suggested that history was only moments away from changing forever. The operators believed they were completing a routine technical experiment. They had no idea they were standing at the edge of one of humanity's greatest technological disasters. At 1:23 a.m., the final phase of the test began. Valves were adjusted. Equipment responded. The turbine started slowing down exactly as engineers intended. But inside the reactor core, invisible forces were accelerating beyond anyone's control. In just a few seconds, everything would change. The decisions made over the previous several hours, combined with hidden design flaws and dangerous operating conditions, were about to unleash an explosion unlike anything the workers had ever imagined. The night was silent. The city was asleep. And beneath the massive concrete structure of Reactor No. 4, history was preparing to rewrite itself forever. At exactly 1:23:40 in the morning, the operators pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button. The button was designed to stop the nuclear reaction immediately. Instead, it triggered the opposite. As the control rods entered the reactor core, their graphite tips briefly increased the rate of the nuclear reaction. power surged with incredible speed. Within seconds, Reactor No. 4 produced many times more power than it had ever been designed to handle. Pressure inside the fuel channels rose violently. The massive steel tubes began to rupture. Superheated steam expanded with tremendous force. Then came the first explosion. The blast lifted the reactor's 2,000-ton biological shield from its foundation. Concrete shattered. Steel twisted like paper. Pipes burst apart. The roof of the reactor building was ripped open. Only moments later, a second, even more powerful explosion tore through the destroyed reactor. This explosion scattered burning graphite blocks and radioactive fuel high into the night sky. For the first time in history, the core of a large nuclear reactor was completely exposed to the open air. A brilliant blue glow appeared above the destroyed reactor. Some witnesses later described it as strangely beautiful. In reality, it was deadly. The blue light was caused by intense ionizing radiation interacting with the surrounding air. Workers who looked directly at it had no idea that invisible radiation was already passing through their bodies. Inside the control room, confusion spread immediately. Many operators refused to believe the reactor had exploded. Such an event seemed impossible. The control panels still displayed confusing information. Some instruments had stopped working entirely. Others showed impossible readings. Several supervisors believed only a water tank had exploded. Others assumed part of the cooling system had failed. No one imagined the reactor itself no longer existed. Outside, pieces of burning graphite lay scattered across the roofs of nearby buildings. Some of the glowing black blocks weighed several kilograms. Firefighters arriving at the scene thought they were ordinary construction materials. Without protective equipment, they picked them up and kicked them aside to reach the flames. Within minutes, they received enormous doses of radiation. Yet none of them realized what was happening. The first emergency calls reached the local fire station almost immediately. Firefighters rushed toward the power plant believing they were responding to a routine industrial fire. Leading one of the first crews was Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik. His team had trained for fires involving electricity, oil, and industrial equipment. Nothing had prepared them for an open nuclear reactor. As the fire engines approached the station, the firefighters could already see flames rising above the shattered building. Glowing debris covered the ground. Pieces of burning graphite continued to ignite new fires across the roofs of neighboring structures. If those fires reached Reactor 3, the disaster could become even worse. Without hesitation, the firefighters climbed onto the rooftops. They carried heavy hoses through smoke and darkness. Water sprayed across burning tar and concrete. Again and again, they moved closer to the radioactive debris. Every minute increased their radiation exposure. Still, they continued fighting the fire. They believed they were saving the power plant. In many ways, they were. Inside the station, engineers desperately searched for answers. Communication systems began failing. Radiation monitors quickly exceeded their maximum limits. Unfortunately, the available instruments could only measure relatively low radiation levels. When the meters displayed their highest possible readings, some officials mistakenly concluded that radiation was not especially dangerous. The reality was far worse. The instruments simply could not measure levels that were thousands of times higher. As confusion continued, workers were ordered to inspect the reactor building. Several men entered areas where lethal radiation filled the air. Many returned feeling sick within minutes. Some experienced nausea. Others developed headaches and dizziness. A strange metallic taste appeared in their mouths. These were among the earliest signs of acute radiation exposure. Still, few understood their cause. Meanwhile, life continued normally inside Pripyat. Most residents slept peacefully. The explosion had awakened some families. Many looked out their apartment windows and noticed an unusual glow above the power station. Some believed they were watching a large industrial fire. Others stepped onto balconies to observe the strange colors in the night sky. Children watched with curiosity. Couples gathered outside. Photographers captured images. No one warned them that radioactive particles were already drifting across the city. The wind carried invisible contamination over streets, parks, schools, and apartment buildings. People unknowingly breathed radioactive dust into their lungs. Around the station, firefighters continued battling dozens of separate fires. Despite overwhelming danger, they prevented the flames from spreading to other reactor units. Their courage undoubtedly reduced the scale of the disaster. Many would later pay for that bravery with their lives. As dawn approached, the extent of the destruction slowly became visible. Where Reactor No. 4 had once stood was now a massive crater filled with twisted steel, shattered concrete, and burning graphite. The reactor core remained exposed. Radioactive gases poured directly into the atmosphere. No containment building existed to stop them. For the first time, radioactive materials were being released freely into the environment. Inside government offices, confusion quickly turned into secrecy. Officials struggled to understand the situation. Some feared widespread panic more than the disaster itself. Telephone calls moved rapidly between local authorities, plant managers, military commanders, and officials in Moscow. Yet clear information remained scarce. Hours passed before the true scale of the accident became apparent. Even then, many leaders hesitated to admit what had happened. At hospitals in Pripyat, doctors began receiving the first injured workers and firefighters. Patients arrived with burns, vomiting, weakness, and severe exhaustion. Medical staff initially believed they were treating victims of an ordinary industrial explosion. Only gradually did doctors realize they were facing something almost no one had ever encountered before: massive radiation exposure. Outside, the sun rose over Pripyat. Birds sang. Buses followed their normal routes. Children prepared for school. Parents went shopping. The city appeared peaceful. Yet invisible radioactive fallout continued settling across every neighborhood. The disaster was no longer confined to the power plant. It had become an environmental catastrophe affecting countless lives. The explosion lasted only a few seconds. Its consequences would last for generations. And while the people of Pripyat continued their ordinary mourning, the invisible cloud rising from Reactor No. 4 was already beginning its journey across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and eventually much of Europe. As the morning of April 26, 1986, unfolded, the situation at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant grew more dangerous with every passing hour. The fires on the roofs had largely been brought under control, but the reactor itself continued to burn. Deep inside the shattered core, temperatures remained extremely high. Radioactive gases, smoke, and microscopic particles were rising thousands of meters into the atmosphere, carried by the wind across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. At first, local authorities struggled to understand what they were facing. Many officials believed the accident was serious but manageable. Others simply refused to accept that an RBMK reactor could explode. Reports sent to Moscow often underestimated the severity of the disaster, delaying critical decisions. Meanwhile, the people of Pripyat continued their normal routines. Children played outside. Families walked through the parks. Fishermen cast their lines into the Pripyat River. Wedding parties gathered for photographs. People stood on balconies watching the damaged reactor from a distance, unaware that invisible radiation surrounded them. The highest levels of contamination spread across rooftops, streets, playgrounds, and forests. Every breath carried radioactive particles. Every minute increased the dose received by thousands of unsuspecting residents. Doctors at the local hospital began noticing alarming symptoms among firefighters and plant workers. Many patients suffered from severe nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and painful skin burns unlike anything caused by ordinary fire. Medical staff quickly realized they were dealing with acute radiation sickness. The injured firefighters were soon transferred to specialized hospitals in Moscow. Many believed they would recover within a few weeks. Tragically, many never returned home. As more information reached Soviet leaders, the scale of the catastrophe became impossible to ignore. Radiation levels around the destroyed reactor were far higher than originally reported. The exposed reactor core continued releasing dangerous materials into the atmosphere. Still, the evacuation of Pripyat did not begin immediately. Nearly 36 hours passed before officials finally gave the order. On the afternoon of April 27, an enormous convoy of buses began arriving from cities throughout the region. More than 1,000 buses lined the roads leading into Pripyat. Residents watched with confusion. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed they were leaving for only a few days. Others thought it was simply a temporary safety measure. Loudspeakers throughout the city announced that every resident should prepare for a short evacuation. People were instructed to bring identification documents, some clothing, essential belongings, and food for several days. Officials assured everyone that they would soon return. Most families locked the doors of their apartments expecting to come back within 72 hours. Meals remained on kitchen tables. Photographs stayed on shelves. Children left toys beside their beds. Pets waited by windows for owners who would never return. Within just a few hours, nearly 50,000 people left the city. Bus after bus departed in long columns, carrying families away from the only homes many of them had ever known. Pripyat fell silent. The schools closed. The amusement park never officially opened. The Ferris wheel, scheduled to welcome children during the upcoming May Day celebrations, would instead become one of the most recognizable symbols of the disaster. Yet emptying Pripyat solved only one part of the problem. The destroyed reactor continued burning. Scientists feared something even worse might happen. Molten nuclear fuel was melting through the reactor building. If it reached large pools of water beneath the reactor, experts believed a massive steam explosion could occur. Some calculations suggested such an explosion might destroy nearby reactors and release even greater amounts of radioactive material. Whether those predictions were entirely accurate remains debated today, but at the time the threat was considered extremely serious. Immediate action was necessary. A dangerous mission was organized. 3 plant workers volunteered to enter the flooded lower levels beneath the reactor building. Their objective was simple in theory but terrifying in practice. They had to locate and open drainage valves, allowing the water beneath the reactor to escape before molten fuel reached it. Carrying flashlights, the men entered dark corridors filled with radioactive water. Every step exposed them to intense radiation. The mission was performed under enormous pressure. Eventually, they found the valves. The water drained successfully. Their actions became one of the most famous stories associated with the Chernobyl disaster. At the same time, helicopters began flying directly over the destroyed reactor. Military pilots faced extraordinary danger. Flying low above the exposed core meant entering areas with intense radiation and powerful updrafts created by the heat below. Nevertheless, flight after flight continued. Crews dropped thousands of tons of sand, boron, clay, lead, and other materials into the open reactor in an effort to reduce the fire and limit further radioactive releases. Each mission lasted only minutes. Yet those few minutes exposed the pilots to radiation levels that would have frightened even experienced nuclear specialists. Still, they returned again and again, determined to contain the disaster before it grew even worse. While helicopters worked above the reactor, another critical operation was unfolding beneath it. Scientists feared that the intense heat from the molten nuclear fuel could eventually melt through the concrete foundation and contaminate underground water supplies. To reduce this risk, thousands of miners were brought to Chernobyl from coal mines across the Soviet Union. Working in extremely difficult conditions, they dug a tunnel beneath Reactor No. 4. The work was exhausting. Temperatures underground often became unbearable, and many miners removed much of their protective clothing simply to continue digging. They labored around the clock, knowing that every hour could make a difference. Although later studies suggested that some of the feared scenarios never occurred, the miners' determination became another symbol of the extraordinary human effort that followed the disaster. Across the exclusion zone, thousands of soldiers, engineers, construction workers, doctors, scientists, and volunteers arrived to help. Together they became known as the liquidators. Over the following months, more than 500,000 people would take part in the cleanup and containment operations. Their tasks were incredibly dangerous. They washed radioactive dust from buildings. They removed contaminated soil. They cut down forests. They buried vehicles, equipment, and entire villages that could no longer be safely inhabited. One of the greatest challenges was clearing the roof of the reactor building. Explosions had scattered highly radioactive graphite and fuel fragments across the rooftops surrounding the destroyed reactor. The radiation levels were so intense that even specially designed robots sent from the Soviet Union and other countries quickly failed. Their electronics stopped working under the extreme radiation. With machines unable to perform the job, humans were sent instead. Small groups of soldiers climbed onto the rooftops one at a time. Each man was allowed only a very short period, often less than 2 minutes, to shovel radioactive debris over the edge before running back to safety. Every second mattered. Their exposure was carefully limited, but even those brief missions delivered significant doses of radiation. Later, these workers became known as the biorobots because they performed tasks that machines could not. Meanwhile, engineers raced to design a structure that could isolate the destroyed reactor from the outside world. Construction began on an enormous concrete and steel shelter, later known simply as the sarcophagus. Building it was unlike any engineering project attempted before. Heavy machinery operated in contaminated areas. Workers often had only minutes to complete assignments before rotating out. Despite the difficult conditions, construction advanced at remarkable speed. By November 1986, the first sarcophagus enclosed the remains of Reactor No. 4, reducing the release of radioactive material into the environment. Although it was never intended to last forever, the structure represented a crucial step in stabilizing the site. Beyond the power plant, the consequences continued spreading across Europe. Radioactive clouds crossed international borders. In Sweden, workers at a nuclear power station detected unusual radiation on their clothing while arriving for work. At first they suspected a leak at their own facility. Only after careful investigation did scientists realize the contamination had come from outside the country. This discovery forced the Soviet Union to publicly acknowledge that a major nuclear accident had occurred. Until then, official information had been limited. The world was finally learning the truth. For the people who had lived in Pripyat, however, the truth came at a heartbreaking cost. Most would never return to their homes. Their city remained frozen in time. Schools stood empty. Apartments slowly decayed. Trees grew through cracked roads. Nature gradually reclaimed the streets once filled with laughter and everyday life. The Chernobyl disaster had become far more than an industrial accident. It was a human tragedy that affected families, communities, and entire generations. It changed international attitudes toward nuclear safety forever and demonstrated the devastating consequences that could result from design flaws, human error, and a culture of secrecy. Yet even amid unimaginable danger, the courage of firefighters, doctors, miners, pilots, engineers, and liquidators prevented an even greater catastrophe. Their actions came at an enormous personal cost, but they helped protect millions of people from consequences that might have been far worse. The battle against the invisible enemy had only begun. The legacy of Chernobyl would continue to shape science, medicine, engineering, and the lives of countless people for decades to come. And even today, nearly 40 years later, the name Chernobyl remains a powerful reminder that technology can bring extraordinary progress, but only when matched with responsibility, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to safety. When the immediate crisis had finally been brought under control, the world was left to confront a disaster unlike anything it had ever experienced. The fires had been extinguished, the damaged reactor was hidden beneath a massive concrete sarcophagus, and the people of Pripyat had disappeared. But the consequences of the explosion were only beginning. In the months that followed, scientists worked tirelessly to measure the extent of the contamination. Radioactive isotopes had spread across vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Smaller amounts were carried by the wind into many other European countries. Large regions of farmland became unsafe for agriculture, forests were contaminated, and rivers were carefully monitored for signs of radioactive pollution. Around the destroyed reactor, officials established what became known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Covering roughly 30 kilometers around the power plant, the area was declared unsafe for permanent human settlement. Thousands of homes, schools, factories, and public buildings were abandoned. Entire villages disappeared from maps, their residents relocated to newly built towns elsewhere. Pripyat quickly transformed into a ghost city. Nature slowly began reclaiming the empty streets. Trees pushed through cracked pavement. Moss-covered abandoned buildings. Apartment windows shattered under years of wind and snow. Inside classrooms, notebooks still rested on desks. Children's toys remained scattered across bedrooms, exactly where they had been left during the hurried evacuation. Every object became a silent reminder of lives interrupted in a single afternoon. Despite the contamination, wildlife gradually returned. Wolves, elk, deer, wild boar, foxes, beavers, and many species of birds spread throughout the exclusion zone. Scientists continue studying these populations today. Although radiation has affected some plants and animals, the absence of permanent human activity has allowed many ecosystems to recover in unexpected ways. Chernobyl became one of the world's most unusual natural laboratories. The original concrete sarcophagus, completed in 1986, was never designed to last forever. Built under extreme conditions and in remarkable haste, it slowly deteriorated over the following decades. Engineers worried that parts of the structure could eventually collapse, releasing radioactive dust once again. To solve this problem, an international effort involving dozens of countries began designing a new protective structure unlike any ever constructed before. The result was the new safe confinement, an enormous steel arch large enough to cover an entire stadium. Weighing more than 30,000 tons, it was assembled beside the damaged reactor before being carefully moved into position in 2016. The structure now surrounds the original sarcophagus, helping prevent the release of radioactive materials while allowing engineers to safely dismantle unstable parts of the old shelter in the future. The project represented one of the largest and most complex engineering achievements ever completed at a contaminated nuclear site. It also demonstrated how international cooperation could address a problem affecting the entire world. Yet even with this remarkable structure in place, the work at Chernobyl is far from over. Scientists estimate that fully dismantling the damaged reactor and safely managing its radioactive materials will require many more decades. The legacy of Chernobyl is measured not only in years, but in generations. Beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, the Chernobyl disaster changed the way the world viewed nuclear energy. Governments introduced stricter safety regulations, redesigned reactor systems, and created new international agreements for reporting nuclear accidents. Organizations around the world strengthened cooperation, ensuring that future incidents would be communicated quickly and investigated openly. Engineers studied every detail of the disaster, determined to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. For the survivors, however, the lessons were deeply personal. Thousands of former residents of Pripyat were forced to build new lives in unfamiliar cities. Many never saw their homes again. Children grew up remembering only fragments of the place where they had been born. Families carried photographs, letters, and small personal belongings that became the last physical connection to the city they had lost. The firefighters, plant workers, doctors, soldiers, helicopter pilots, miners, engineers, and liquidators who responded during those first days became symbols of extraordinary courage. Many knowingly entered dangerous areas to protect others. Their determination helped prevent an even greater catastrophe, and their sacrifice continues to be honored around the world. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains one of the most unusual places on Earth. Scientists visit to study radiation, ecology, and long-term environmental recovery. Carefully supervised tours allow visitors to witness abandoned schools, silent apartment blocks, the famous Ferris wheel of Pripyat, and the massive new safe confinement covering Reactor No. 4. Every building tells a story, and every empty street serves as a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can disappear. Time has changed the landscape, but it has not erased history. Trees now grow where children once played. Wild animals roam through neighborhoods that were once filled with families. Silence has replaced the sounds of everyday life. Yet beneath that silence lies one of the most important lessons of the modern age. The Chernobyl disaster was not caused by a single mistake alone. It resulted from a combination of reactor design flaws, human error, inadequate safety procedures, poor communication, and a culture that discouraged questioning authority. When these factors came together, the consequences reached far beyond the walls of a single power plant. Even decades later, researchers continue studying the health, environmental, and technological impacts of the accident. New discoveries help improve nuclear safety around the world, ensuring that the painful lessons learned in 1986 continue to protect future generations. Chernobyl is more than the story of an explosion. It is a story of science and responsibility, of bravery and sacrifice, of loss and resilience. It reminds us that even the greatest technological achievements require humility, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to safety. On the night of April 26, 1986, history changed forever. The explosion lasted only seconds. The radioactive cloud traveled for days. The cleanup continued for years. And the lessons will endure for generations. Today, when people hear the name Chernobyl, they do not think only of a nuclear power plant. They remember a city left behind. They remember the firefighters who rushed toward the flames. They remember the liquidators who faced an invisible enemy. They remember the families forced to leave everything they owned. Most importantly, they remember why the world must never allow such a tragedy to happen again. Because history is not only something we remember. It is something we learn from. And as long as the story of Chernobyl continues to be told, the courage of those who faced the impossible and the lessons they left behind will never be forgotten. The disaster changed the world. The people changed history. And their legacy will live on forever.